Mad cow disease is one of those things that's so terrifying you just have to pretend it doesn't exist. Or maybe that's just me. It's a fatal disease with no cure that's spread by proteins, and you can catch it just by eating a cheeseburger. Since this disease popped up so suddenly and is so absolutely horrifying, researchers have spent a lot of time studying it. And one thing that jumped out at them was that a lot of the people who got sick were young, like couldn't even run for US president young. So researchers really wanted to figure out why that was. And after decades of connecting the dots, we may finally have an answer. Mad cow disease, more formally known as variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or VCJD, is a prion disease. They're super rare, which is good news because they're also terrifying. And to explain why, we have to start with what a prion is. Prion proteins exist all through our bodies, but the majority are concentrated in our central nervous systems, mainly in our brains. But sometimes these proteins get misfolded, and that's where the problems start. See, a protein is just long strings of amino acids that are folded up into a 3D shape, and that shape is critical to letting that protein do its little protein job. And that's true of all of them, prions included. And the cells that make these proteins are also in charge of making sure they get folded correctly before they get sent off into the wide world of your body. Normally, when a protein is misfolded, it gets destroyed, and the cell that made it tries to get it right the next time. But sometimes, misfolded proteins get out, and that's where they can start to cause problems. So just to recap our vocab, when we say prion protein, that means the normal and correctly folded guys that we all have. But when we say the word prion on its own, that means the disease-causing bad guy protein, which leads us to the reason that prion diseases are next level scary. Regardless of how it's folded, a protein isn't alive. And since it isn't alive, the immune system can't kill it. Like our immune systems work by identifying a bacteria or a virus or any other pathogen as being foreign and killing it. Once it's dead, that bad thing usually can't make you sick anymore. But because prions aren't alive, they can't die. And the other problem with CJD is that a prion is like an ant. There's never just one. That's because one misfolded prion can bind to other correctly folded prion proteins and bend them out of shape too. So even though there was just one badly folded protein to start, that prion will bend others, which causes affected brain cells to die and release even more prions. Eventually, enough brain cells are killed that clusters of these prions will form in the brain. All those misfolded proteins in your neurons can cause major neurological problems, including trouble moving, insomnia, personality changes, dementia, coma, and death. So yeah, CJD is super scary. It's always fatal, often within a few months or years of diagnosis. There are a few types of CJD, all of which are classified based on where the patient's first messed up protein came from. There's sporadic, meaning a prion protein native to your body just got folded wrong one day and we have no idea why. Hereditary, where there was a mutation on the gene that codes for the protein, resulting in instructions to misfold it. Or acquired, which means that, well, you acquire the misfolded protein. This happens via exposure to blood, brain, or spinal tissue from somewhere in the environment. Most of the time, this is iatrogenic, which is just a fancy term meaning that it happened during medical treatment, like if equipment that was used in your brain surgery was contaminated with misfolded prions, or if you got a corneal transplant or graft of the tissue that covers your brain from someone already infected. There are even some super rare cases of transmission via blood transfusion. But acquired CJD doesn't have to be iatrogenic. It can also happen when someone eats beef that has been infected with the cow version of a prion disease. And CJD that is acquired from cow proteins is called variant CJD. So to figure out how variant CJD got into humans, we need to figure out how prion diseases got into cows, which takes us back to the 1980s. Back when parachute pants and leg warmers were all the rage, some cattle farmers in the UK noticed their cows started acting strange and then just up and dying. They determined that these cows had a new disease, which researchers called bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE for short. But Everyone else just called it mad cow disease. This wasn't the first prion disease we'd found, either in animals or people. There's this one that sheep get called scrapie, which causes them to rub their sides against walls and stuff, hence the name. And at this time, we already knew about classic CJD in humans, so the concept of us having a prion disease was already out there. But what we didn't know was that prion diseases could cross species, which might be why these UK farmers treated this new disease like a nuisance and not a public health concern, at least not right away. And because nobody thought this thing was contagious, they didn't exactly tread cautiously when it came to disposing of cows that had died of BSE. So let's talk about what they did with those dead cows. Feeding livestock takes a lot of food. So to cut costs, farmers would take the waste products from slaughtering their cows, grind them up, and turn it into a high-protein animal feed called meat and bone meal, which is as gross as it sounds. They'd also do this with the bodies of any of the cows that had died ahead of slaughter, since it was thought that the way they were processed would kill just about any pathogens that made it into the grinder. So when the first cows started dying of BSE, they too got turned into cow food. And eventually, those cows that were fed this contaminated food ended up as our food.
This SciShow video is supported by Giving What We Can, an organization inspiring more people to leverage the power of effective philanthropy. There's a vast wealth inequality in this world, and if you think about that on a global scale, it means that you might be much richer than you often feel in your day-to-day life. This means ordinary people can have extraordinary impact by committing a portion of their resources to highly effective charities. To that end, over 9,000 people across 100 countries have taken the 10% pledge, a public commitment to donate at least 10% of your income to the charities you believe can best improve the lives of others. Hundreds more have taken the trial pledge, where you choose how much income to donate and for how long. You can join the movement to build a better world through philanthropy at www.givingwhatwecan.org/scishow.
Like we said, the first cows started getting sick in the mid-1980s, but it took until the 90s for the first cases to appear in humans. That's how we learned that mad cow disease can incubate in your body for over a decade before you start showing symptoms. And we've since learned that prions are basically indestructible. They're heat resistant and survive being boiled, aren't destroyed with alcohol, and they stick around in soil for literal years. If that sounds scary, I'm sorry, but I'm about to make that so much worse. It's been estimated that 3 million cows that had asymptomatic BSE made it onto people's dinner tables in the UK. That's horrifying. But here's the thing. Even though probably everyone who so much as looked at a burger in the 1980s probably came in contact with these prions, only a couple hundred people have ever been diagnosed with variant CJD. So naturally, researchers wanted to know why, which meant looking at the demographics of exactly who got sick. And right off the bat, they noticed an unusual pattern. While classic CJD is most common in middle-aged or elderly people, the average age of variant CJD patients was under 30. Given that we know there's a decade-long incubation period, that means that the majority of those patients became infected in their teens. And that's really weird. Like, it's not unusual for diseases to hit really young children harder because their immune systems aren't fully geared up yet. But in this case, it looked like teenagers were the most susceptible, even more so than little kids. The easiest explanation was that maybe teens just got more exposure to the contaminated beef. But a 2004 study looked into that and found no evidence that teens in the UK ate any more burgers or meatloaf than any other age groups. So that left researchers wondering what it might be about teenagers that made them so vulnerable to variant CJD. Well, it took some time, but a paper published in 2016 seems to have the answer. And it's in our guts. We all have these small bits of tissue called Peyer's patches in our intestines, and on top of these patches are immune cells called M cells. M cells are basically the TSA of your gut, checking over everything that passes through. If the M cells aren't sure about something that goes by, they'll grab it and send it over to your other immune cells, like T and B cells. And it's the T and B cells' jobs to give it a pat down and figure out if that thing is a pathogen or just some Dorito dust. If that questionable particle fails the vibe check, those T and B cells raise the alarm and neutralize the threat. But they can't seem to do that to those pesky prions. Like we said, they're not alive, so they can't die. Plus, T cells can only look for intruders based on their amino acid sequences, not their shape. And these prions have all the right amino acids, so they can fly under the radar. Remember, the problem is just how they're folded, but all the amino acids are the same as a correct protein. Since properly folded prion proteins already exist in the body, the T cells would just recognize that sequence of acids as a thing that's supposed to be there and let it through. And at least some B cell activation relies on T cells too. So if the T cells don't catch the intruder, then the B cells won't either. Even if some B cells try to destroy the misfolded proteins that the M cells brought in, prions just so happen to be resistant to the enzymes they'd usually use to kill pathogens. So the M cells invite these little protein disasters right into the body, and then the rest of the immune system doesn't know what to do with them, so just lets them go. Then the misfolded prions are free to bump into healthy prion proteins and start misfolding them. And researchers have some pretty strong evidence that of all the immune cells, it's the M's that are most at play. Researchers created lab mice that had either more M cells than usual or no M cells at all. Not only did the mice with bonus M cells get prion diseases faster, but the ones without M cells were immune to getting the prion diseases through the oral route. Which brings us to the reason that teens are the most at risk of prion diseases. See, even though everyone has Peyer's patches and M cells, people in their teens and early 20s have way more Peyer's patches than other age groups. We don't have many Peyer's patches at birth, and as we grow up, we gain more right until puberty, and after that, we start to lose them. More Peyer's patches means more M cells, which means more chances for misfolded prions to get into the body. So, if you have a whole population of people eating contaminated beef, the people with the most Peyer's patches are the ones that are most likely to have an M cell bring that prion into their body. Then the disease incubates for 10 years and you get a bunch of people that start showing symptoms in their late 20s, early 30s. So it took us some time, but it seems like there's a pretty good answer to the weird pattern in who got sick with mad cow disease. Thankfully, mad cow disease is super rare now, as in there have been fewer than 10 cases globally in the last decade. A lot of that comes from prevention and monitoring of the cows themselves, but as with all super scary diseases, researchers are working hard to find a cure. Will Peyer's patches be the answer? It's tough to say, but knowing more about how the disease is transmitted is a promising start. So even though this disease sounds scary, there's no need to have a cow.